So good morning, Brendan. I am going to introduce you to everybody. You are Professor Brendan Buckley and you're the chair of our scientific advisory board. But the reason I wanted to talk to you this morning is because you have rafts and reams of experience in clinical trials all around the world and the development of orphan drugs, new treatments, vaccines, all of that. You've been consulting for companies for many, many years. So you have your ear to the ground. And everybody who's paying attention at the moment is concerned about coronavirus and then obviously the vaccine so that we get our life back to quote unquote normal. And so I thought you were the perfect person to kind of break it down a little bit for us and talk to us a little bit about it this morning, because I know you have the inside knowledge on some of these things. So I suppose the first thing I wanted to ask you was, you know, we're hearing that there's like 10, 12, 13 viruses kind of looking very promising or coming to market at different times. And I just wanted to ask you, there seems to be about 4 different types of vaccine in terms of how they're going about creating the immunity. Can you tell us a little bit about what makes them different from each other?
Sure. Well, the 2 vaccines that are in use at the moment in the Western world are based on messenger RNA. So the coronavirus, its genetic code is in RNA, unlike ours, which is in DNA. And the Pfizer, which is now approved in Europe, and the Moderna, which is likely to be approved before the end of the year in Europe, they both work by giving a string of RNA which is like an incomplete coronavirus by injection, and the RNA goes into our cells, and the machinery in our cells which make protein, that machinery is taken over to some extent by this RNA, which programs the machinery to make bits of virus. And those bits of virus are pushed out by the cell into our circulation, and our immune system sees them, recognizes them as being strangers, and sets up a defense against them in the form of antibodies and T cells and so forth. So essentially, this is a way of seeding our immune system with a whole load of components of the virus without exposing us to the virus at all. Now, while this is a relatively new way of making vaccines, people have been working on this for well over a decade. And other vaccines, apart from coronavirus, have been produced, although not yet on the market, using this technique. Things like Ebola, for instance. So we're very lucky that it has turned out that the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine both claim an effectiveness greater than 90%. The next kind of vaccine, which is in the pipeline, is people will hear about, is the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And this is completely different. So what this does, this uses a virus which causes chimpanzees to get a cold.
Okay.
And that virus has stuck into its genetic code a string of sequences which program for coronavirus proteins. So what happens there is the chimpanzee virus comes in, it's taken up into our cells. They use a chimpanzee virus because we've never encountered, our immune system won't kick the chimpanzee virus out immediately. Gets into our cells, and the coronavirus genes that are inside in it, again, hijack our cell machinery that makes proteins, and we make a set of virus proteins. Our immune system reacts to that. So these are the 2 kind of, the RNA virus, the messenger RNA vaccines, and the chimpanzee vector vaccine, as it's called. Much more traditionally, and for centuries, we've used vaccines which are the infective bug, but it's modified to depower it. So it's an attenuated bug. So there are attenuated coronavirus vaccines that are being made, whereby the coronavirus itself is injected, except the version of the coronavirus that's injected is unable to reproduce itself and cause infection. So this is very similar to how we vaccinated against smallpox and polio and so forth. And it's an approach that's been used literally for centuries, since the 1700s. And then there are vaccines which depend on the injection of proteins. So you can make viral proteins and inject those and expect the immune system to react against these and to protect us against these. So they're a little bit farther down the line. Just as a sign of it, we have, it's said, well more than 150 different vaccines that are in various stages of development at the moment. So it's, there's considerable hope that this thing will go on and will continue to develop further. So we have, a lot of hope that beyond the vaccines that are going to be immediately available in the next couple of weeks to us, there's lots more in the pipeline, and our ability to fight whatever the coronavirus produces over the next year or two is very, very, very advanced. The vaccines that are available at the moment are quite expensive. And one of the issues is that whereas countries like ours can afford them, lots of poorer countries can't. So there are much cheaper vaccines that are in development, which will be much easier to make and which won't require, for instance, very cold storage and transport facilities to be available.
Like so the Pfizer one is the one that has like very, very low temperatures, right? That's
right. That's got to be brought around at a temperature of minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And when you think that your fridge is minus 80, your freezer is minus 18 out in the kitchen, it's a long way down. Yeah. But, we can handle that here, but it's difficult to do that in other countries that don't have the wealth that we do.
And so most of those vaccines, they're kind of, when you say that they're producing proteins and things like that, most of them have chosen to use the kind of characteristic protein of this particular virus, which kind of creates this crown effect. So, so even if the virus would be mutating, we're hearing about mutations and things like that, it's not likely to change that component structure because that's the thing that allows it to invade the host, isn't it?
That's right. The main protein that we attack is so-called spike protein, which is the one that sticks out of the virus. And that attaches itself like a key in a lock to structures on our cell surfaces as a means of getting into our cells. That spike protein is actually quite large in protein terms. So there are hundreds of basic components in that. Mm-hmm. And a mutation is just a change in one of these components. So we can all get very kind of scared about mutations and changes in the coronavirus, but it's actually, in real terms, it's a bit like, putting an extra rock on top of a cairn on top of a mountain. It's not going to change the mountain and it's not going to change the appearance. So, the protein, the spike protein may function a little bit better as it appears in the South of England variant at the moment, but the immune system is still going to recognize it. So no matter how many rocks climbers will carry up to the top of Carrauntoohil, you'll still know it's Carrauntoohil if you look at it from the lakes.
I can imagine. Well, look, one thing that I think has been fascinating about this is how fast they've developed a vaccine and got it like through all the regulations and through all the testing and out there. Because, you know, at the very beginning, and I suppose when it became kind of widely known in March, you know, it was like, it normally takes 10 years. Maybe we could get it in 2 and 3. And here we are with something in less than a year. So like, how come they've been able to manage to get it out so quickly?
We didn't start from scratch. So there's a very big knowledge base underneath this, which has enabled us to get going. The Chinese very early on identified the virus and completely described the structure of it in total detail, so that we were even able to go and make bits of the virus artificially in the lab very early on, say by the end of January. So then we knew how to go about developing vaccines, because vaccines have been around since the 1700s. But we were much quicker at making these for a very simple reason. Governments recognized that there was going to be huge economic cost from the pandemic. So they poured enormous amounts of money into dealing with the risk that pharma companies take. Normally, if I were to set out now to develop a vaccine against something or other, I'd have to test it. I'd make it. I would then test it in animals, maybe over about 6 or 8 months. I would then sit a while and see whether it looked promising and was prepared to make the investment in the next step, which could be maybe tens of millions of dollars. Then goes into humans, and that could take 3 or 4 months for that experiment. And then you sit back and see what you think. And then you decide, you go to an investment committee next month and they decide whether they'll put the money in. And there's a lot of time in between these steps in which people are making decisions more or less at leisure. And the main consideration is the business consideration, whether they can make the next investment. What has happened with coronavirus vaccine development is that governments have guaranteed the risk. So they've underwritten the risk financially. The companies as they've done all of these steps in parallel instead of in sequence. So they've said, we believe enough in this vaccine that we're going to try it in animals, but we'll also try it in humans at the same time. And while we're figuring out how it's doing, we'll put it in a bigger trial, and we're going to put it out into 40, 50,000 people because the pandemic is raging and we can't wait. And the risk is much less than the potential benefit. So a vaccine that's going to work could, for example, stop the deaths of 3,000 people a day in the United States. Mm-hmm. So a risk of, say, a very rare allergic reaction that might occur in 1.5 million people is small compared to 3,000 deaths a day in the US from the virus itself. So that has enabled things to move quickly. Also, regulatory committees, so like the European Medicines Agency here, the FDA and so forth, they've just pulled out the stops. They've put a lot more people to the task of evaluating these vaccines. So the evaluation process has been quicker because they've just put way more manpower to it. Yeah. And that doesn't mean that there are any corners cut. In fact, I'm pretty sure there haven't been. I used to sit on various European Medicines Agency committees, and I used to teach at the FDA. And I know that the corner cutting just does not happen.
It's not in their DNA.
It's not in their DNA. So, you know, and they're people the same as the rest of us. You know, they want safe and effective vaccines for their mother and granny and their kids and themselves.
Yeah.
So they're not going to, they're not in the pocket of somebody to accelerate this.
But the other thing is that they also kind of invested in the ramping up of production, because normally you'd have gone through all the testing and then start to worry about how am I going to mass produce it. But it seemed like they said, okay, well, we're going to take the bet that this is going to work and we're going to work on how to mass produce this. And maybe it won't work, but we'll be ready if it does. And that obviously required huge investment as well, because a private company wouldn't be able to take on all that, but all the governments funding them allowed that to happen,
That's right. So, the European community ponying up hundreds of millions in support has been a huge factor in that, because it's enabled the companies to take the risk of setting up manufacture, knowing that they might have to shut it down unsuccessfully, but at least their costs are going to be covered.
Well, look, you obviously are on our scientific advisory board for cancer research, and one of the questions we do get asked is, okay, so we've managed to get this vaccine out in record time, we meaning the research and scientific community, and we have seen huge changes in survival for some cancers, but why are we not seeing this pace of change in terms of new treatments for, we'll say, poor prognosis cancers? And obviously cancer is a much more complex disease, but maybe you could speak to a little bit about that, because, people who have other diseases can get frustrated at the idea that this has gone so, we're not 100% there yet, because we don't know, we're not all vaccinated, we're getting there, but that the pace of progress has been so massive. Why hasn't that been the case in something like cancer,
Well, The pace has been very rapid. I suppose the kind of immediate extreme urgency has been a big factor in it. And that's where government have been prepared to put huge investment just into one thing. But the pace was enabled by the fact that the foundations are already there. And the foundations for developing this vaccine were built over decades. And we have to build the foundations before you can put up the house on it. So, you could put up a timber frame house on top of a field with no foundations and it'll be blown away in the next gale. Mm-hmm. But if the foundations are there, you can then build steadily on top of that. So cancer research has been built on enormous effort in putting down the foundations and understanding the disease. And there are concepts that we have figured out really in the last 5 or 6 years that we knew nothing about before that. Mm-hmm. So how cancer and the immune system react with each other, for example, is only recently been understood. And we, on top of that understanding, all of a sudden, there are a whole pile of new treatments have emerged following, more than a decade of just slog work on understanding really high detailed things about the immune system and cancer. So you have to do the hard yards and put the foundations down before you can then go off on a solo run and score the goal, Yeah. So, and that's why just patience is very necessary in just understanding that every small advance you do gets you closer to an ultimate treatment. Yeah. There has been a huge improvement in survival from lots of cancers now. And I suppose we've gone after the ones that affect the most people. So you see big improvements in things like breast cancer, big improvements in lung cancer, melanoma, and a lot again in the malignancies that affect the blood system. So I look back over my time in medicine and I see just an enormous improvement from when I was a medical student. Things were so crude, and now things are very sophisticated and targeted and effective. So I think, if you look at treatments for cancer, things seem to not be improving a lot at all for a while, and then there's a big advance and things suddenly change. And melanoma was a real example of that.
Mm-hmm.
This the tumor of the the pigment cells in the skin, which was a terrible condition up to now. But in recent years, that has improved enormously. And the pace of advance has been almost like the vaccine pace. You know, one day there was nothing. That day next year, there's a lot, which has made a big difference.
Yeah, but usually years and years behind it. And I suppose, look, that virus is, as you said at the beginning, you know, they characterize the whole code and genetic code of this virus really quickly to give everybody that kind of underpinning knowledge that they needed to go off and do it. Where in cancer, even between 5 different patients, they can have very different esophageal cancers are very different, and there are multiple mutations that are interacting. And it's also your own body cells going out of control, not a foreign agent. Do you know what I mean? It's a more complicated disease to go after, you know.
It's way more complex. Like this coronavirus is one of the simplest active biological things. You know, it's not alive in the conventional sense, but it's really very simple. And that has enabled us to make rapid progress with it. Mm-hmm. As you say, within any individual, even within a single tumor, there are lots of different mutations. So it's like almost as if you have hundreds of different viruses that are all causing a problem.
Yeah.
So within the same tumor, each cell can look subtly different from the cell next to it. And that's what makes cancer different from normal tissue.
Yeah. But I suppose the bottom line is it's about good ideas coupled with money. You know what I mean? Like ultimately, you know, the thing that will accelerate the pace, like technology has accelerated things, but ultimately it's, you know, more people working on it to get it to go faster, you know.
Well, if you're going to build the pyramids, you need loads of money, you need loads of people, and you need loads of time, and you need loads of stone and mortar and cement and everything. Yeah. So to make significant advance, you need all of these components: horsepower, researchers, funds, time, and brilliant ideas, brilliant design.
Yeah.
And bringing those together into the project of defeating cancer is a challenge, but it works.
Yeah.
We've made such enormous advances, and we will continue.
Yeah. I mean, it is we are in an infinitely better position now than we were, 20, 30 years ago. And I suppose the pace of that change is accelerating. It just can seem sometimes frustrating for people who are waiting for their loved one when they're watching something in a different scientific field, you know, or in a different aspect of medicine going so quickly, you know what I mean? And that's kind of a hard one. But I was going to ask you, now I'm not going to hold you to this, you don't work in government buildings, and I don't know if you have Tony on speed dial, but I wanted to ask you if, when do you think that in Ireland we might have a vaccine out and kind of universally out there? Obviously, some people may be vaccinated even starting at the end of this year. I heard the 30th of December, but kind of commonplace that we think that people will be getting vaccines outside of the very vulnerable populations, maybe. The party line, I guess, from government is that it's going to start before the new year. So we will have people vaccinated for the last couple of days of this year. And they're targeting real frontline healthcare workers and residents in nursing homes. And of course, staff in nursing homes clearly as well. And then it's moving on to people in my general age category. And from there, it depends, I think, on two things. One is the supply of vaccine. And we should be in a good position here. Mm-hmm. The European Union has done well in picking, I think, the winner, the first available. And we have the facilities and capability of handling things at -80 degrees centigrade. Yeah.
I mean, in the labs that we support in Breakthrough, there are lots of minus 80-degree freezers. It's part of the scientific toolkit that we use.
Absolutely.
So we have the capability of doing it, and it's then a matter of manpower and supply.
Yeah.
So we can throw manpower at it, and there are plenty of people like myself would be happy to volunteer and come back, out of retirement and come and do that kind of stuff.
You're willing to leave West Cork, beautiful West Cork? Or you just vaccinate people down West Cork?
I'd be happy to stay down here and do it. Plenty of people in West Cork would be grateful for it as well. So, but the party line is that by the end of the summer, the nation should be vaccinated if the nation wants to be vaccinated.
Okay.
But I think it'll be a lot quicker. I'm much more optimistic about Ireland's ability to get this stuff done when we set our mind to it. So fundamentally, it's a matter of organisation and supply.
Okay. Well, you actually just touched on what was going to be my last question to you. And look, anytime there's talk about vaccines, there's a lot of, anti-vaccination kind of stuff on the internet and things like that. I mean, would you, as a person who probably has their ear to the ground a lot closer to most on even the development of the vaccines that are out there, have you any fears about taking the vaccine yourself? Are you going to be top of the line?
I'll be in the front of the line. I'll be elbowing people to get up to the front of the line. I have no reservations about the safety, but I understand why people would have. It looks like it's been very fast, and therefore it's natural to wonder if corners have been cut. I'm pretty happy that they haven't. People worry about RNA because it's unfamiliar, and they kind of link it with DNA, and they wonder whether it'll cause them to grow two noses or cause long-term harm. It won't. The RNA is incredibly unstable. And every time you catch a cold or do anything like that, you're getting loads of foreign RNA into you, and your body deals with it incredibly quick. Your body can't afford to leave RNA hanging around the place because it would just be very wasteful. So it's eliminated really in an extremely short period, like a matter of minutes.
Yeah.
So it doesn't hang around there for years, and it can't cause any genetic damage. When, if you eat a feed of cod, chips and peas, you're getting grams of RNA into you, but it's all cleared out.
Yeah.
So I have no reservations at all about that.
I suppose the good thing too is that because there's multiple ones coming, there isn't the same pressure. Like if there was one, there'd be an awful pressure I mean, they wouldn't do it because that's not what their thing is, but you'd imagine there'd be an awful pressure to say, we've just got to take anything. Where in this circumstance, they've got a choice. And so therefore it's only the best and the safest that could ever come out there. Do you know what I mean? Because, and they all have to follow the same regulations. It's the same path through the trials that we would have to follow in things that were being developed for cancer. It's not a different thing, and there's no shortcuts. It's just they've been able to do it faster because, as you say, they didn't have to pause and decide, is it worth taking it forward? And, and they had a lot of background work done before they got there, So so I suppose we can end really on a quite hopeful note. Obviously, things are going a bit pear-shaped at the moment, so we still have to do all the social distancing, and you're cocooned down there in West Cork, wear masks, wash our hands and sanitize everywhere we go until it's there. But I mean, it is a very hopeful position to be in than we would have thought we could have been in when we were looking at March, and there was nothing in front of us really at that point,
That's totally right. And we're going to have to behave ourselves, until a substantial proportion of the population get vaccinated. So that will be into the early summer anyway. And in the meantime, wouldn't it be an awful tragedy if, a couple of yards from the finishing line, we started to fall and trip over ourselves and, act the idiot and fail to finish the race?
Yeah. Well, you look around the world, and I won't name the countries, and we have, in fairness to the Irish population, been very patient and done quite well. And the government has been quite aggressive at times in terms of the lockdown, and we've been, for the most part, very compliant. And so that's actually meant people's lives have been saved, because when you look at other countries, you see the difference. Other developed countries have not followed the same path. And so I suppose, as you say, we're almost there now. So now is not the time to fall over our own shoes right before we touch them.
I think when you listen to lobbies and so forth on the TV and recognizing, the terrible situation that some industries are in and some people are in, there's a question, I think, that should run in the back of everyone's head is, how many deaths are we prepared to trade for some nebulous concept of the economy? Mm-hmm. I mean, I've never met an economy in my life. I've never gone to the funeral of an economy. I've gone to the funeral of plenty of people. And I know quite a number of people who've died, of friends of mine or spouses of friends of mine around the world who've died of coronavirus. So I'm not happy to trade people's lives for some nebulous concept of the economy. And countries that have behaved really well, like ours, are doing well enough in their economy and should have enough to share to help people out who've been badly hit. Countries that have been permissive, like the United States and Britain, their economies are on the floor because they just can't hack it.
Yeah. Well, that gamble hasn't paid off in any way. They don't have the economy, the strong economy, because it's crippled by the amount of people who have it, and they have a huge amount of people lost to the virus that potentially didn't have to be. So look, again, let's end more hopefully. We've a vaccine, many vaccines coming, and we not maybe going to all have the Christmas that we expected, and we're certainly going to be away from other people, but it'll be worth it in the end, and it's just a little bit longer to go now. So listen, Brendan, I just want to thank you for taking the time and for all your knowledge. It's really, really impressive. I know you have huge history in this area, so you were the person I wanted to ask all the questions to.
Thanks very much, Orla, and happy Christmas to you and the Breakthrough team and everyone who supports Breakthrough.
Thanks, Brendan.
God bless.